Hello everyone and welcome to my highway engineering class, and in this video we will discuss highway classification. And this is a very easy topic, and we are very interested in classifying our highway in terms of functional classification. So we're going to talk about classifications in general for highways, but we're going to focus on what we call functional classification of the highway. In other words, we want to divide different highways so we can start designing them, and the main function of the highway that we want to design our road on that basis is its function. Our work is based on this AASHTO document, which is the Highway Function Classification Concept Criteria and Procedures. We're going to talk about how we divide the highway, how we classify the highways into different components, and based on its function. When I say function, we're going to talk about two things about function. How can we define different kinds of highways? So let's jump into our presentation. So this is the PDF. This is where the website for the PDF, the AASHTO PDF that I just showed you, and this is the resource for this lecture. So as you know that in geometric design we deal with dimensioning of the elements of the highway. We deal with designing the elements of the highway. Number of lanes, vertical and horizontal curves, cross sections, any kind of furniture related to this highway. So we do this is what we call geometric design, and function classification is some kind of an intro into this geometric design. So the factors that influence the highway design, well, number one, function classification, and this gives us everything else that you're going to see here on this slide. For example, the volume of vehicles, which is the hourly volume and vehicle mix. The design speed, which is a main input in our highway design, and classification gives me some good indication of what is the design speed that I will be using. The design vehicle, what kind of predominant vehicle that uses the highway. Then it comes the cross section of the highway, and this is part of our design, but we want to figure out how many lanes, how many shoulders and medians. So these are different components in the highway we have to decide when we design the highway, and it all comes from what kind of highway it is, the function classification of that highway. If you have more steep grades with heavy vehicles, then the function classification will be a little bit different, and everything else that you can see here which comes from function classification will also be different. The level of service, how convenient and how comfort you want the drivers to have, and less delays and higher speeds, which gives me better level of service. Funds, money also is one huge factor that influence your highway design, and also it comes from function classification. The higher level the road, the more expensive it is, and that's very obvious. And safety. Safety is sometimes that you want to also use in design. So you can notice here, and finally we have the environmental factors and social factors. But you notice here that number one that comes, and most of these factors depend on that, are what we call here functional classification. So when we say function, we mean that the road has a function to move people, right? And also to give people access to something. And here comes the main idea of functional classification. Highways, in general, can be defined by the travel movement. So when we define travel movement, we have three types of movement. Number one, which is the first one here, which we call the uninterrupted movement. Let me put here my pointer. So which we call here the main movement, where people want to go from one place to another with no interruption, so it's uninterrupted. And this gives me what we call here the word mobility, we're going to talk about now. I'm going to skip to the third one, where we have a road, and this road gives space and gives access to wherever you want to go. If it's school, if it's house, if it's shop. So the local roads and the driveways and these smaller roads that take you to the parking lots and take you to your house, take you to your school. This is what we call here local access. It gives you accessibility. And here comes the second function of a road, which we call here accessibility. Between these two, we're going to find some kind of road that connects both of them, that collects traffic from these local roads, number 3 here, and it collects this traffic and throws it at some bigger road, which we have here, which has the highest mobility for the main movement. And we all have that when we go somewhere, especially when we travel from one city to another. We go from our local road to a bunch of collectors. The roads become bigger till you hit the interstate from the best exit here, and it takes you to the interstate with the highest mobility, meaning that you have faster. It's the main movement. It should be uninterrupted. Definitely is interrupted by some congestion, but when I say interruption, it's interruption by means of design interruptions. So based on these 3, we're gonna function classify our highway. A good example here, you see that a lot when we have an interstate, which has the main movement, and it connects through other roads via some kind of ramps, and these ramps intersect these. Usually these roads are either one of two, either what we call here an arterial or a collector, the one that we just decided. We talked about. If it's a big road that still holds heavy traffic, it's probably an arterial. If it just collects traffic to a bigger road, we call it a collector. So you can intersect these two together, and let's imagine that you come from here. So this is your origin, and when you want to go here or your destination, you come from the main road here, and this is where the arrows are. You take the exit, go to this kind of collector where it distributes, or let's go to this arterial, and from the arterial it goes to a collector, and from the collector you can go to one of the local roads till you go to your final destination, and vice versa. Before we get into function classification, let's just highlight very fast what are the different kinds of classification schemes. And again, it depends on what you want to do. Who are you? And what do you want to do? Well, number one, if you're a designer, you definitely want the function classification, but sometimes you classify it based on the design types. In other words, you want to design specific kind of roads. So it's based on major geometric features. For example, when you design a freeway, it's going to be different than a conventional street. It's different than some kind of a highway. So we can classify it based on that. Some designers classify that, plus our functional classification. So again, this is called by design types. Again, we want to design a street, we want to design a highway, or we want to design a freeway. Each one has a specific kind of components in it. You rarely find a sidewalk on the freeway. So it's something specific to the conventional streets. And that's what we mean here by the design type. What is the cross-section of each of them? When you're defining the federal, the state, and the local highways, you want to number them. You want to figure out who has responsibility of them. So here, when we talk here about transportation officials, then you want to define here by what we call here the numbering of the routes. So we classify the routes like US roads, state roads, county roads, and interstate roads. So these are, and each one has a different type of numbering, different color. It tells you exactly who operates that road. Sometimes we have what we call here administrative classification. It tells you also who is responsible about operating and maintaining this road. So we have what we call here the national highway system and the non-national highway system, the federal and non-federal as well. So this is, again, These are different kinds of classifications other than the one we are focusing on in this video. In this video, we're going to focus on this guy here. When we talk about functional classification, how do we classify the roads based on its function? And it gives us numbers, gives us factors, gives us values to design your highway. Because each one of these have different kind of design criteria, as they have different also kind of design components, exactly like we did when we said based on the design. So both actually kind of the same, but again we look at it different because we classify these based on how it's function. And when we talk about function, we define two things: the mobility and accessibility. So, based on these two, we have three kinds of highways. One that holds most of the traffic. It has higher speeds. It's major. When I say here by major, it has high speeds, it has least interruptions. We try always to serve the high volumes of traffic going there. It might be freeways, it might not be, and we call these arterials. The second one, which connects to that, and it collects traffic from smaller roads, and we call these collectors. These have higher speeds, the arterials have higher speeds than the collectors, which have also higher speeds than the locals. Finally, the locals we all use, and they are the longest roads. If you have a map, they are the one that it's like the veins of your body. It goes throughout everywhere. So it has, when you look at in terms of length, the length of your network of locals is much higher than collectors and arterials. Even though arterials is like, it can be really long, or interstates and highways, but still the locals, especially in cities, they have the highest distances, but arterials hold most of the volumes. So function classification, let's define it now. It identifies particular role of the highway in moving vehicles. What's the role? Is the role the main direction, the main mobility? Is the role to give access, or is the role to collect? It carries expectations about roadway design. So once you know, and this is why we're studying it at the beginning of our class, it gives you expectations about the design. It tells you a little bit more about what's expected speed, what capacity should you get for every lane, how many lanes as well, which gives you the final capacity of the road, and relationships to existing and future land developments. So again, when you do a land development, when you're building a new city, you want to figure out what kind of road it is, because it's going to tell you an idea about what design it is. And again, this is a very important, we talked about this in class, but let's talk about it again. It determines the eligibility for funding and gives priority for funding. Usually states like to give priority for roads that have more traffic, and the least priority is the local roads. So again, it gives you what we call here eligibility for funding. In class, I'm going to give you this handout. I gave some of you already this handout. It's the guidance to practice to assign function classifications and urban boundary defined by census. So these are the two tables that was given in class. I'm going to discuss this in the next video as well. When we build a new highway, we classify it. So in the design, once it's built, once it's operating, we classify. The classification might change when volumes increase, when the importance of this highway increases. So it might be reclassified after a few years, but usually it's kept as it is. Once it's constructed or reconstructed, you build something else, you add lanes, the classification might get improved and moved to another kind of classification. So these are different components of the function classification of my highway. A very important thing that, so since now you're having a whole network, And the network has also what we call here connectors. One of the most famous connectors are loops and ramps that connect the smaller level road or the small functional road, probably a collector, to our main road, maybe the interstate here, the interstate road here, and there are some connectors. And the question is, what is the classification of that connector? So the rule of thumb here that comes from AASHTO is that ramps and other non-mainline roadways, like ramps, loops, connectors, are to be assigned the same functional classification as the highest functional classification among the connecting mainline roadways served by the ramp. So when I look at this, I ask you, okay, what is the function classification of this ramp here? Is it a collector or is it a main arterial? Well, it's going to be always, since it's connected to the highest one, it's also be classified as a main arterial. And it's actually logic, because when we want to design this ramp or loop, we want to design the same criteria where this interstate or this freeway it is, with probably the highest speed, with the same kind of pavement, with the same curvature, and so on. So we will always want to classify this also as the highest classified road when we have connection between two. These are simple rules. Now let's talk about the three of them. Actually, the three of them are actually classified into more. When we talk about arterials, we have actually two types of arterials, and it's now subclassified. We have this guy here, principal arterial, and minor arterial. Let's figure out what's each, and we're going to look at the tables and show you in terms of census, in terms of population, which one do we think we classify. This is very obvious. This is less obvious, especially when we talk about collectors in minutes. So for principal arterials, the first one here, number one, all the interstates that you can see are principal arterials. Any freeway, any expressway, that's defined as a principal arterial. They serve very large percentage of travel. When I say percentage of travel, we talk here percentage of either your ADT or percentage of VMT. What's VMT? Vehicles miles traveled. The more traffic you have, the more ADT you have, of course, and then the more VMT. But usually it's between cities and activity centers, and that's why freeways, expressways, and interstates are all what we call here principal arterials. In this one, you have the highest mobility. Mobility is the best. Why? Because we have zero interruptions, no signals, no stop signs, no exits to stations, only ramps. And the ramps are designed in a way to decrease the interruptions with the main line. So here the highest mobility is the one you have here in the principal arterials. So we want to minimize the travel time. Get back here, so let me bring back my pointer. We want to minimize the travel time and the distance. So this is the main function for that. So again, it's highest mobility, meaning that the minimum travel time and distance. And it holds thousands and thousands of vehicles. It holds most of the vehicles. People love to take the freeway because they don't stop at signals. They don't get delayed at any signal. Usually it's the route of choice for intercity buses and trucks. So most of the trucks, you can see that in the interstate. These are called principal arterials. They are usually the interstates. Other freeways, so any other freeways that are not interstates, we call them also principal arterials. Expressways, which are semi-freeways and semi-not freeways. And we have here other principal arterials. And they are roads like you can see in this picture. They might have interruptions, but they are still the main highway connecting these cities, and we call them principal arterials because of the percentage of ADT. And in the table that we use in AASHTO, we try to use the ADT to figure out what kind of classification the road is. So these are the 4 different types. So again, interstates, which definitely are freeways. Freeways, again, when we have to access, we need ramps and loops. We don't have any kind of signalization or stop signs or access. Any other freeways that are not interstates, all kinds of expressways, and finally other principal arterials that, again, like this one in this picture here. When we consider the functional classification, we have these 2 terms, mobility and accessibility. The mobility is the ability to travel with ease to different destinations with reasonable cost, efficiently, and with the highest speed. Accessibility, the ability to gain the entry to a particular site or area, parking lot, transfer facility, school, home, you name it. And for goods, this is the accessibility definition for goods. Again, the good transportation has to be like a tree with a stem, with some branches, and some twigs. So we have the main, we have the collection, and we have local roads. So it has the balance between both. It provides mobility and provides also some kind of accessibility. Arterials provide the best mobility, locals provide the best access, and collectors strike the balance between the 2. This is a curve that I briefly drew a few slides ago. It shows here the value of mobility and the value of accessibility. You're going to notice something? They contradict each other. The more access you have, like for a road that has lots of driveways and shops and gas stations, the speed goes down. And the higher speed, it's very hard to get to the next gas station. You need to get out and you need to look at the exit and so on. So they contradict each other. So these are the different kinds of highways, starting from the freeway, the expressway, the major or principal arterials, the minor arterials, the collectors, and then the locals. We have started talking about the major or the principal arterial. We haven't yet talked about the other ones. Another curve here that shows you that they contradict each other. So the blue here shows the mobility, and you can see here the locals are the highest access, the arterials have the highest mobility, and between them we have the collectors. So, when we consider the highway function classification, other factors might go in when we want to figure out what type. So we want to figure out, again, all this is for us to figure out, okay, what kind of highway it is. So number 1, we can measure what we call the efficiency of travel. It's defined by the travel time or defined by the delay. In other words, high percentage of length of long distance made on arterials, and shorter trips use locals and collectors. So again, when we have a long trip, the length and how efficient it is, we define this by means of arterials. The collector, it's shorter than arterials, longer than locals, and it provides what we call here circulation. Usually when we have a city, you have a collector that probably goes around, that collects traffic from the local roads. It's like, usually it's like has this circular characteristic. Finally, access points. If arterials face increasing number of access points, less mobility, we use access management principles. I'm going to show a picture of that. For example, if we could here driveway consolidation and median installation. As an example here, this is what we call here both of them. When we have this is a main highway, we use this kind of access management principles, in which we, instead of having 1, 2, 3 local roads that create more friction here, along with a turning lane in the middle, we put the median to force cars to use the intersection, and we minimize the number of access to the road using this kind of access management principles. When we consider what kind of function classification, we consider speed limits, we consider the AADT, we consider the vehicle miles traveled, or the VMT. It tells me, AASHTO gives us these numbers and tells us which one you classify. And also the spacing between the arterials. Again, for example, 1 to 5 miles from arterials, it gives you what we call here better speed limits and higher speed limits. From our handout, this is some of the factors that are used to define which kind of highway it is, and it's always sometimes used to like a tiebreaker when you have two roads and you want to figure out which one to use. So again, we have the arterial, collector, and local. One thing you have to make sure, and again these are some of the rules of the thumb for AASHTO, is that you must always what we call here the system continuity. It has to be continuing, meaning that arterials, the bigger roads, should always, when I say connect, it should always end at other arterials. You rarely find a big freeway ends at a stop sign, going to becoming a smaller road. It happens. We have exceptions, of course, but this is not the best design. Always, a freeway loves to finish at the freeway. So when I say here connect, arterials have always to throw its traffic to another arterial. It might throw its traffic, this happens sometimes, to 2 collectors or 3 collectors, so it's dividing the traffic into smaller ones. So sometimes the design forces you to something else, but usually when you have a freeway, when you have a main arterial, it has to end up in another arterial. It should not connect, and that's not a good idea. It should not connect end at the lower classification. There are definitely exceptions in different cities. The arterials, I'll say a split of lower classification, and this is what I was telling you about. For collectors can connect to arterials, can end up at an arterial. This is very, very normal, but not the other way around. Locals can end at any kind, doesn't matter. Locals are everywhere. But again, we always sometimes want to consolidate these locals when we hit this kind of a main road, especially when it's a street road. When we define our classification, we have 2 types of classification. So now our classification was 1, 2, 3, arterials, collectors, local. Now multiply them by 2. We add in the beginning either the word rural, out of the city boundaries, or the word urban, inside the city boundaries. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So again, we have urban, and AASHTO defines it in different ways. A rule of thumb here is that if you have more than 5,000 people in an area, that's an urban area, otherwise it's a rural area. So again, the density and types of land use, the nature of travel patterns gives you an idea what's kind of classification in terms of urban and rural. And now, let's move to the complete classification. Remember now we had 6? We're gonna make this 6 actually 10. What do you mean by that? So number 1 is either urban or rural. And for the arterials, we're going to divide the arterials into what we call here principal arterials. And now it's urban principal arterials, rural principal arterials. And the second one, we define that as the interstates, expressways, and other freeways. And now the new one here, we have what we call here the minor arterial. And we have also urban or rural. So now we are having 4, right? 2 here, 2 here. And then collector, and we have also 2 types of collectors, urban major collector and urban minor collector. Rural major collector, rural minor collector. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and finally urban locals, rural locals. And these are the different criteria of picking. There is some kind of a gray or shady area sometimes between these two different every two different classifications, and AASHTO tries to help us, give us some guidelines of which one to pick. This is when we build a new city and we wanna do some kind of urban planning for that. The black ones here, the big black, these are usually, we have only very few urban arterials. This is for urban. And you see here the dotted ones, black and white, these are the collectors. And then we have, you can see here, the most of the roads are local roads that connect to the houses and businesses and so on. For rural, same thing, but the word rural comes in beginning. It's when you have areas outside the urban boundaries, and cities define where the urban boundaries are. And the design is different, and one of the most obvious things is that usually rural you don't have sidewalks. You rarely have sidewalks. You more have like shoulders or other kind of cross-sectional elements. So again, we have now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and same in the urban. And this is a shape of a rural. Again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 main arterials, and the rest, the thick ones here are collectors, and the smaller ones here are locals. And again, you can see the locals have the most distances in your classification. Again, when we do the classification, we know that now the design criteria, which we'll be studying next, and the level of service, they change according to the function of the highway facility. And we're going to give you the handout. Let me first actually show you the handout that I was keep talking about. So when we go to our document here, this is the handout that classifies between the different kinds of highways. Let me get to it. It's a table, and this table here, I'm going to come in a second, and this table here, yeah, this is the two tables. One is for arterials. This is for arterials. Start here with interstate, other freeway, so all these are principal arterials. And then the minor arterial gives you all kind of information in terms of the lane width, the AADT or the traffic, divided or undivided, how is the access controlled in this case, the average VMTs, and the mileage on each one of them. The second table goes down to collectors and local values, and it gives you some kind of guidelines of figuring out, okay, my highway has this amount of volume, these amount of lanes, what do you think the classification should be? Or the other way around, I'm designing a major collector, how much volume expected to be there in that major collector. So these are the two handouts that we'll be using. And let's get back to our presentation here. So some of the design criteria or design numbers or values. Number one, the number of lanes that you expect on each kind of classifications. So you can see for the arterials, you can go up to 8 lanes, even sometimes more. Collectors have between 2 to 5 lanes, and the local is either loop, cul-de-sac, or 2-lane local road. The role of a function classification is very simple. Once you know the gender of the baby, you want to give it a name. Exactly the same thing. Once you know the function classification of the road, you're going to figure out the design speed. You're going to figure out the components of the cross-section, mainly in how many lanes, and other things in the cross-section. And for the design speed, you're going to do all the geometric design that you want. So once a particular function classification has been established, the flexibility available to the highway designer is considerably limited here, that you know exactly what you'll be doing. You're very limited by the design speed and other criteria that we'll be using and we'll be discussing in the next video. The design components related to highway class are either the cross sections, we're going to design the horizontal and vertical alignments, and finally we're going to do the intersections and interchanges, and they're all connected to what kind of highway you have. When we talk about freeways, yet it's part of the major or principal arterials, but it's very, very special. We can consider it a function class by its own mean. It has its own geometric criteria because it has its specific way of design. and due to major difference in operations between this type of highway and surface arterials. There's a big difference between when we design a freeway and when we design any kind of highway in the city. It's much different in the design criteria. So by this we're done. Guys, I want you to go ahead and read in our textbook either chapter, for our last edition is chapter 15, just 4 pages in chapter 15 in the new edition. If you don't have the textbook, I have the handout for you, the one I just was looking into right now. Please have a good read in that handout, especially the tables that we talked about, and you based on that will be having some examples on classification of the highway. Again, guys, thank you so much, and see you in the next video. Have a great day.